here at Constitution Gardens, which is this large reflecting pool with ducks. And the Washington Monument's in the background. A few little ducks swimming around in some algae growing here on the pond, like a Monet painting. But we're going to head this direction, and we're going to do a little walkthrough of a couple of the monuments down on this end of the National Mall. So we're, of course, down at the western end of the National Mall. Sort of mid-evening here on a nice summer day. Trying to keep the camera as steady as I can, but apologies if it's rattling around a little bit. We're going to cut through the trees here. We're going to make a little trek over to the entrance of the Vietnam Memorial, which is right over here. You can start to see it emerge here in the background. If you look back this way, you can see the Trump Hotel popping up across this field. Some people just relaxing the afternoon away. Constitution Avenue is the street that you see right through those trees. On the other side of the avenue is a memorial to Albert Einstein, interestingly. So we're gonna take a spin here through the Vietnam Memorial, which is actually quite a somber memorial, commemorating one of the bloodier, and depending on your perspective, perhaps more fruitless wars in American history, attempting to push back the tide of communism in Asia. So the memorial is just names upon names upon names of those killed in the Vietnam War. Of course, if we turn back around, you can see the Washington Monument in the background. Of course, the Vietnam Memorial is very somber. It's obviously about remember. Wreaths and other things that have been left behind, flags and pictures for people, probably by relatives many years since. If you look back now, you can see the Capitol Dome just popping up there in the distance. But it's obviously a somber memorial. It was designed by Maya Lin, who was a very young artist and architect at the time. I think she was in her teens actually when she designed this memorial. It's very controversial at the time. A lot of the soldiers who really felt like they had died, or that their colleagues had died fighting for something, thought the memorial was maybe a little bit too much like a tragic memorial as opposed to a war memorial. And as such, they actually erected separately these three soldiers over here were pointing their weapons kind of back toward the memorial, almost like the memorial is the enemy. But they wanted to have some soldiers actually to put a human face on the war, and the fact that those were not just individuals who died for or not, but individuals who died fighting for a cause that they had, presumably most of them, believed in. And there are these little stands where you can actually flip through and find the names of the different veterans who passed away. And where their names are enshrined on the memorial. To our left here, obviously, is the Lincoln reflecting pool. And then poking out over here is a drop-off area for the Lincoln Memorial. And across the distance, you can see some of the buildings rising up across the Potomac River in Virginia. So now, of course, we're looking at the Lincoln Memorial. Rising here in the foreground of this big plaza. The view back down toward the Washington Monument. If we count them, I believe there are 88 steps up the Lincoln Memorial, which is probably, I would have to imagine, is the top destination of all the memorials in Washington. Maybe beating with the Washington Monument, but the Lincoln is probably, well, Lincoln, of course, was the 16th president, serving from 1861 to 1865 before he was assassinated in office by John Wilkes Booth at the Ford Theater. So we got to the top of the steps. Just take a second to look at this view back down the mall over the reflecting pool down toward the Washington Monument. It's quite a spectacular vista. Next, when we move to the side, we'll see some of the Capitol building too. I want to show you a little bit of the colonnade here. And then the view here in the memorial of Lincoln himself. It's a memorial, it's not a tomb. But there he is. It's in this temple, as in the hearts of the people for whom he saved the Union. The memory of Abraham Lincoln is enshrined forever. Of course, Lincoln's statue here is commemorated on the penny. You really see the Washington Monument back there. In each vestibule of the memorial, which is this very large space, is a little section commemorating one of Lincoln's two most famous speeches. On this side, the Gettysburg Address, his famous speech after the Battle of Gettysburg, that at the time was barely noticed, but which in hindsight has been remembered as the greatest speech, arguably, in American history. The one that starts with, 407 years ago, our forefathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. And it's the speech that closes by renewing the mission for which the Civil War was fighting. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these brave dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. Some of the most famous lines uttered in American history. The other side of the memorial commemorates Lincoln's other really great speech, which was his second inaugural address, which is a much more complicated speech that begins with fellow countrymen and goes through a lot of arguments explaining the lead up to and the causes of the Civil War, and which closes with 2 paragraphs that talk about both the lack of apology for the Civil War, that this is a necessary event in American history, and that those who are fighting there are actually renewing the American promise. Yet if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. In other words, those who are dying here by the sword are making up for those who died by the lash. But he changes tone in the final paragraph to also try to bring the country back together. In other words, the Civil War is justified, but also that after the Civil War, we will be one country once again, with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. In other words, trying to renew the peace with the South once the war finishes. Although Lincoln didn't know at the time that the war was actually on the doorstep of finishing, just a few months away. Of course, he would be dead just a few months later as well. So there, of course, is the view back down the mall. You're starting to see the Capitol building popping out behind the Washington Monument there. And we're going to take just a little spin around the memorial, because the colonnade allows you to walk all the way around. To the north here is some of the streets that go back up into the downtown of Washington, including near the Federal Reserve and the State Department, George Washington University, and then ultimately K Street, which is the predominant business street of the city. And as we look out here, over across to the skyline of Roslyn, Virginia, across the Potomac River, we're reminded that, of course, Washington is a district sitting between 2 states, Maryland and Virginia, and that we're only a stone's throw away from Arlington. So this bridge takes us across to Arlington National Cemetery. Roslyn, over here, the downtown of Northern Virginia, is DC's equivalent to Canary Wharf. Arlington National Cemetery is this way. The Pentagon's a little bit further down. If you were to take this bridge straight, you would go right into the entrance to the cemetery, which sits upon the hillside there. As one looks across the bridge, you can see up there by that crane, just the little house that's poking up at the very top of the hillside, the former home of Confederate General Robert E. Lee, who led the Confederate forces in the Civil War. So quite a poignant American moment here, that from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial you can literally see the house of the lead general of the Confederacy. And it really hammers home the idea that these 2 countries that existed side by side for 5 years, in fact, are one shared nation with a shared history. So the memorial to Ulysses Grant, who was the lead Union general in the Civil War, is the other end of the National Mall. But I've always found this a very poignant moment of the Lincoln Memorial, where you can see the Lee House, and then there's the skyline again of Roslyn. Here, as we start to wind down the evening, the first little bits of sunset, so you can see the colonnade in the shadows. As we walk back this way, we'll get a view of the Capitol Dome poking out up ahead. It's barely there by the Washington Monument. Normally, there would be a lot more tourists here. Summer, obviously, can be a little bit different in Washington. These little spots on the side of the memorial, usually full of kids sliding down. Usually a lot more tourists here. There are a few, usually a lot more. Run. People biking, scootering across the plaza here in front of the memorial. Looking down toward the World War II memorial, the other end of this section of the mall, on the other side of the reflecting pool. And of course the Washington Monument, which sits there next to, not quite visible, but the National Museum of African American History. The dome there that's not the Capitol Dome, you see, is from the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History, which is a little bit further down the mall. But beautiful vistas, of course, in Washington. There's a view down the path that would take you down toward the Washington Monument. There's some police on horseback over here. We're going to do one more stop here on a little walk here.
The bird just fell in the trash.
We're going to swing here through the Korean War Memorial. I believe right now the fountain for the Korean War Memorial is off. It's a little bit unfortunate because it's not quite as poignant, the memorial, with that the case. But at any rate, the Korean War Memorial obviously commemorates the Korean War, first part of the 1950s. It's sort of a mirror image of the Vietnam Memorial in some respects. It's a little bit different. It sits on the other side of the Lincoln, juxtaposed. Another war trying to stave off the spread of communism. These soldiers kind of working their way through a really dense vegetation. There's some wreaths here too. Lighting's not so good. You can't quite see the Washington Monument popping up there, but it is. Some wreaths here for the Korean War. Here's these soldiers trek through the memorial. And then this is sort of the terminus of the memorial.
54,000 U.S. and 500 UN, 600.
Counts of the dead. 54,000 U.S.
Wow. Oh man.
8,100 missing. 7,000 captured. And 103,000 U.S. wounded troops. And then obviously far more from the UN. The view sort of from the terminus of the monument. Obviously there'd be a reflecting pool here normally, which is quite moving. And these trees that encircle it with really dense, low vegetation. Of course, it has the writing here, "Freedom is not free." Of course, more wreaths and commemorative elements of the memorial here. Some views under the trees back here. Our nation honors her sons and daughters who answered the call to defend a country they never knew and a people they never met. 1950 to 1953, the Korean War. As we look back at the reflecting pool through the trees, we'll go say hi to the horse before we wrap up here. We'll take one last view of the Lincoln here. So I'll wrap up the stream now, but look forward to seeing everybody around.